They were married on a Saturday in November 1942, in a church too small to hold everyone who wanted to come. The wedding cake was made without sugar, rationing had seen to that. The groom wore his uniform. The bride wore her mother's dress, taken in at the waist. They had known each other for 11 weeks. This was not unusual. In the weeks after Pearl Harbor, marriage rates in American cities doubled, then doubled again. In some cities, the December 1941 numbers were more than twice what they had been in December 1940. Ring companies reported a 250% surge in sales after the Selective Service Act was passed, and after Pearl Harbor, marriage rates in many communities jumped another 60% over the same month the year before. By the spring of 1942, 25 officers were married in a single day at West Point alone, ceremony following ceremony in the chapel like clockwork, half-hour intervals from noon until dark. A marriage mill in Salome, Arizona, ran appointments like a factory. Churches were booked weeks out. Call them, as history calls so many young couples of that year, by the names that fit thousands like them. Call him Ray. Call her Dorothy. He was 23, a machinist from Ohio, sworn in the week after Pearl Harbor. She was 21, a secretary, and she had never traveled farther from home than Cincinnati. They met at a USO dance. He asked her to dance twice. By the second Saturday he asked her father's permission. By the end of November they were standing at the altar. What drove them was not recklessness. It was arithmetic. The newspapers told them daily that men were dying, in the Pacific, in North Africa, in the cold Atlantic. They had watched the newsreels. They understood what shipping out meant. And so they married in November, because November was what they had. Ray shipped out in January. The letters began almost immediately. Dorothy wrote every day. Ray wrote when he could, sometimes daily, sometimes not for 2 weeks, and then 3 letters would arrive at once, and she would sit at the kitchen table and read them in order, date by date, until the kitchen went dark around her. This was the common currency of the war. By 1945, nearly 1 billion pieces of mail were moving between the American home front and the theaters of war in a single year. An average soldier received 6 or 7 letters a week. Troops kept letters in their footlockers and pulled them out at the mess table, faces lit up when letters arrived and dropped when they didn't. Mail call, every study, and every veteran's account agreed, was the single greatest morale event in a soldier's week. The letters were how the war was survived, not just on the front, but at home. But the mail carried darker cargo too. The phrase, "Dear John," a synonym for a breakup letter sent to a man in uniform, entered the American vocabulary during those years. Its first documented use in a New York Times were dispatched from North Africa in October 1943. The historian Susan L. Carruthers, who studied wartime correspondence in depth, described the range of outcomes they produced: stories that ended in reconciliation, and stories that ended in tragedy, and suicides, and lives ended in the bleakest of circumstances. Not every letter that came to the front was a love letter. Not every love letter sustained the love it was meant to carry. The distance was too great, and the people on either side of it were changing too fast, and paper could only bridge so much of that. Dorothy's letters told Ray what she could. The rationing. The neighbor's boy who had not come back. The new job. That was the part she wrote carefully around at first, and then, as the months passed, wrote about more directly. She had gone to work at the aircraft plant outside town. She had not meant to. A friend had mentioned an opening, and she had gone out of curiosity, and then she had taken the job because the pay was 3 times what she earned as a secretary and because the work, she discovered, meant something. She was riveting wing panels. She wore overalls and tied her hair back. She learned to read a blueprint. More than 310,000 women worked in the American aircraft industry by 1943, 65% of its total workforce, against the 1% who had worked there before the war. Dorothy was one of them, and she was good at it, and she knew she was good at it, and that knowledge changed her in ways she could not yet name. Ray's letters to Dorothy were different from hers to him. Not colder, he still wrote of missing her, of the smell of her hair, of the particular way she laughed. But as the months became a year, and then 2 years, there were things he did not write about. He had been moved from England to Italy. He had seen Anzio. He had seen things at Anzio that he had no language for and that he was determined to keep from her. What the army called combat fatigue, what a later generation would call post-traumatic stress disorder, was not in the diagnostic vocabulary yet. The 1946 Combat Exhaustion Report would conclude that psychiatric casualties were as inevitable as shrapnel wounds, that nearly every man had a breaking point somewhere. But in 1943 and 1944, it had no name, and men carried it in silence, and the silence became part of them. Dorothy felt the change in the letters before she could articulate it. The words were similar. The feeling was not. She wrote to her sister that Ray seemed farther away now than when he first left, and she meant something more than geography. She was not waiting in the way the posters showed women waiting, soft and still, fixed at the window. She was working 10-hour shifts. She was paying the bills alone. She was making decisions that had always been his to make, and she was making them correctly, and the independence settled into her bones before she understood that it had. A U.S. Department of Labor Women's Bureau survey of Bay Area war workers found that 70% of them wanted to keep their jobs when the war ended. Dorothy was among that majority. The work was hers. She had built something in herself during those years that had no name either, but it was as real as what Ray had built, and as impossible to put away when the war was done. Ray came home in October 1945, on a Tuesday, on a train that was 40 minutes late. Dorothy stood on the platform with her mother and her sister, holding a sign she had painted the night before. She saw him before he saw her. He was thinner. He stood differently, a stillness in him that had not been there in November 1942, something in the set of his shoulders that made him look like a man listening for something. He smiled when he saw her. They embraced for a long time on the platform, and her mother cried, and everything looked, from the outside, exactly as it was supposed to look. The trouble began quietly. Ray could not sleep. He startled at loud noises, a car backfiring, a door slamming, in a way that embarrassed him and frightened her. He did not speak about the war, not a word of it, and when Dorothy asked, gently, he changed the subject in a way that closed the door on the question completely. The Army had prepared neither of them for this. PTSD would not be formally recognized by the American Psychiatric Association until 1980, 35 years after the guns went silent. What Ray had brought home had no name, no treatment program, no framework. He struggled alone. Dorothy watched him struggle alone, and was not allowed to help. The second difficulty was harder to speak of. Dorothy had kept her job at the plant. When Ray came home, the expectation, his expectation, the neighborhood's expectation, the era's expectation, was that she would come home too. Return to the kitchen. Fold herself back into the shape she had been in November 1942. But that shape no longer fit. She had managed a household and paid a mortgage and supervised other workers and built aircraft components for 3 years. She was not the 21-year-old in her mother's taken-in dress. And Ray, quiet, altered, sleepless Ray, was not the 23-year-old in the church too small to hold everyone. The broader picture confirmed what Ray and Dorothy were living privately. A U.S. Department of Labor Women's Bureau survey of Bay Area war workers found that 70% of them wanted to keep their jobs when the war ended. Many had become the primary breadwinners of their families. They had learned skills and held authority and discovered, in themselves, capacities that peacetime had not asked them to discover. But with the men home, the pressure to return to pre-war roles arrived quickly, and loudly, from employers, from unions, from government, from the culture at large. Women, especially women of color, were the first to be let go as defense contracts shut down. Arguments against female employment, which had quieted during the desperate years of the war, reached a new volume. Dorothy was not an exception. She was the rule. And neither she nor Ray had any framework for navigating what the rule meant for a marriage that had been forged in the absolute urgency of 1942 and had never had the time, before the war, to learn how to simply be ordinary. They loved each other. That is not the contested part of the story. They had written 1,000 letters across 3 years and an ocean, and the love in those letters was real. But love is not the same as knowing a person, and they had never really had the chance. 11 weeks in 1942 was not a foundation, it was a door they had run through because the world was on fire. The men who had gone and the woman who had stayed were, in the truest sense, strangers now, strangers who shared a name, a history, and a profound grief for the version of themselves that the war had unmade. By 1946, the divorce rate in the United States reached 4.3 per 1,000 people, more than double what it had been at the start of the decade, the highest rate in the nation's recorded history to that point. 1 in 4 marriages that year ended in divorce. Church officials had warned of this in 1942, when the wedding boom began. If boys and girls are truly in love, one observer had said then, they will be true unmarried as well as married. It was not cynical advice. It was a prediction that turned out to be accurate for a great many couples who had mistaken urgency for certainty, and heat for compatibility. Ray and Dorothy were not statistics. They were particular people, and the particulars mattered. He found work at a factory. She kept her job, quietly, for another 8 months, until a round of layoffs cleared out the women first, as they always did when the men came back. She was let go on a Friday. She drove home and sat in the car in the driveway for a long time before she went inside. The independence was gone, and with it something she could not fully explain, even to herself. They tried. That is the part of this story that deserves to be said plainly. They went to their priest. They tried to talk. Ray, in his quieter moments, would sit at the table after dinner and say that he knew he was different, that he did not know how to explain what Italy had done to him, that he was sorry for something he could not name. Dorothy would reach across the table and hold his hand. The love was still there, in those moments. It was the life they could not build around it. They separated in the spring of 1947. The divorce was final in September. There were no children. Dorothy moved back to her family's neighborhood and found work as a bookkeeper. She never spoke badly of Ray. Ray moved to Cincinnati, where he had a cousin, and worked construction for 20 years. He remarried in 1952 and had 2 sons. By most measures his later life was ordinary and decent and free of dramatic incident, which means it looked nothing like what it felt like from inside. The nightmares, according to his son, did not stop until he was well into his 60s. Their story was not exceptional. That is, precisely, the point. For every couple who survived the war intact, and thousands did, with hard work and grace and luck, there were couples like Ray and Dorothy, whose love was real and whose marriage still broke, because war does not leave people where it found them. The women who had built aircraft and driven ambulances and managed the home front were not the same women who had watched the ships pull out. The men who had lived through Anzio and the Bulge and the island chains of the Pacific were not the same men who had stood in churches in borrowed time, making vows in good faith. The letters are what remain, in the end. Historians and archivists have collected tens of thousands of them, the thin V-mail sheets, the censored pages with whole lines blacked out, the ones so worn from being read and reread that the ink has nearly gone. In those letters, 2 people reach across the darkness of a war and find each other, word by careful word. The reaching was real. The love was real. What the war could not preserve was the people on either side of the distance, not because duty failed them, but because duty changed them, as it changes everyone it touches, and as it changed the world they had promised to share.